One single decision completely changed the course of history, but almost nobody saw it coming. Welcome to this explainer. Today we're going on a cinematic journey into one of the most devastating technological failures of the 20th century. We're not just talking about a sinking ship here. This is the story of an invisible, vital web of communication that literally broke down in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic.
So what if the loudest warning was just ignored? It's kind of the central mystery of this whole disaster, right? How on earth could the most advanced, luxurious, and supposedly safest ship ever built sail straight into a deadly ice field at top speed? Well, as we dig into the evidence, a pretty terrifying reality emerges. They weren't sailing blind. They were warned over and over again. So what actually happens when the very technology designed to keep us safe turns into this massive wall of noise that just blocks out the truth?
To really understand how things went so incredibly wrong, we actually have to listen to the transmissions sent that night. Just hours before the disaster, this absolutely shocking message was blasted across the airwaves by the Titanic senior radio operator, Jack Phillips. He literally told a nearby ship, the Californian, to shut up because they were interrupting his signal to a coastal station. It's a staggering display of hubris, and we're going to unpack exactly what drove that absolute overconfidence in the radio room.
Which brings us to Section 1, the era of confidence.
To truly grasp the mindset of the men aboard, you have to look at the world they were living in. The early 20th century was defined by this unshakable faith in human engineering. The Titanic wasn't just a passenger liner, it was a 53,310-ton floating monument to that supreme confidence. Commanding this moving fortress was Captain Edward Smith, and while he was highly respected, before 1911, his largest command was only half this tonnage. He frankly didn't have the experience with the massive, unstoppable momentum these giant new liners generated. In fact, there was actually foreshadowed by some near collisions in the years right before this very voyage.
And that mindset perfectly explains this word, unsinkable. Now today, we look at that and think it's pure arrogance or maybe just marketing hype, right? But the crazy thing is, it wasn't magical thinking for them. It was a genuine engineering belief. The White Star Line officials had absolute confidence in this ship because they literally could not conceive of a scenario, any scenario at all, where a massive, multi-compartment breach could happen all at once. They prepared for the absolute worst they could imagine. The problem was, their imaginations just fell short.
Section 2. A modern technological marvel.
Let's move right into the heart of the ship's communication, because this cutting-edge tech is actually what gave the crew a fatal, false sense of total security. Aboard the Titanic sat the most modern radio system in existence. It was a 5-kilowatt rotary spark gap transmitter, and it was capable of blasting out this distinct, musical 840 Hz signal. Up above deck, suspended 250 feet over the sea, were massive twin T-type aerials stretching 450 feet long. Operating this absolute beast were Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, two young guys employed by the Marconi Company. They were the masters of this awe-inspiring equipment.
But here's the fatal flaw in all of this. Even though they had immense power, we're talking a range of up to 2,000 miles at night, the technology for tuning those signals was incredibly rudimentary. Think of it like being in a super crowded room where literally everyone is shouting through megaphones. Because they couldn't cleanly filter out frequencies, stations were just constantly talking over one another. It created these chaotic, deafening traffic jams in the airways.
Section 3. Voices in the dark.
So this brings us to the freezing night of April 14, 1912. The airwaves are just buzzing, the ship is speeding through the dark, and down in the radio room, the primary focus wasn't actually on navigation at all. It was on capitalism. You see, the radio room had handled roughly 250 passenger telegrams since the ship left Southampton. The wealthy passengers sending these personal messages were the ones actually financing the radio's operation. And because the equipment had broken down earlier in the voyage, Phillips and Bride were furiously working to clear this massive backlog of passenger greetings to the U.S. They were exhausted, working frantically, and honestly, their priority was customer service, not maritime safety.
And while they're typing away, a literal ticking clock of doom is counting down. At 7:50 p.m., a critical warning comes in from the SS Masaba, reporting heavy pack ice and large icebergs dead ahead. Then, at 9:05 p.m., another warning comes from the Californian, and that's the one Jack Phillips angrily interrupted. There was basically zero coordination between the radio room and the bridge. Each officer had fragments of the picture, but nobody had the full view. And then, at 11:50 p.m., the iceberg is finally sighted.
Section 4. The fatal miscalculation.
So how did we get from a crystal clear warning at 7:50 p.m. to a catastrophic impact just 4 hours later? Well, it comes down to some very specific human errors and protocol failures that turned a totally predictable hazard into an unprecedented tragedy. Standard navigational warnings were supposed to carry the prefix MSG, which stood for Master's Servicegram. If a message had that prefix, the radio operator was strictly required to physically walk it up to the bridge and get the captain's receipt. But that 7:50 p.m. warning from the Messaba, it simply used the prefix Ice Report. Because of that one missing tag, it was treated as general info. It literally just sat ignored under a paperweight while the ship hurtled directly toward the ice.
Now, you've probably heard the famous legend that if the lookouts, Fleet and Lee, had simply been given binoculars, the whole ship would have been saved. Let's completely dispel that right now. That is a myth. Binoculars heavily restrict your field of vision. They're really only useful to zoom in and identify an object you've already spotted with your naked eye. They do absolutely nothing to help you scan a pitch-black horizon. The true failure wasn't a lack of binoculars at all. The real failure happened hours earlier in the communication chain, trapped right there in the radio room.
Section 5, the final broadcast.
Once the collision actually occurs, the inescapable reality starts to set in. That whole era of confidence, it was over in an instant. The great machine had been mortally wounded. And there's this really haunting detail from that night. Shortly after the agonizing scrape against the ice, the ship came to a dead stop. But then, the Titanic briefly restarted its engines. Surviving passengers actually recalled feeling this comforting, familiar hum of the massive machinery coming back to life. It gave everyone this fleeting, false hope that everything was totally fine, just before the awful truth emerged and the engines fell silent forever. Back in the radio room, the mood violently shifted. That backlog of passenger telegrams was instantly abandoned. Captain Smith walked in and ordered them to send out the call for help. Phillips began desperately blasting the traditional CQD distress signal and later the newly adopted SOS out into the freezing darkness. They were just hoping against hope that someone, anyone, was out there listening.
And those two young men stayed right at their posts, even after being formally released by the captain. But the water was rising fast. At 2:17 a.m., the mighty 5-kilowatt transmitter, the very voice of the Titanic, finally lost its battle. A transmission of CQD to MGY, MGY being the ship's call sign, was cut off abruptly, right in the middle of a letter. The power failed. The connection to the world was severed. Just 3 minutes later, the bow broke away, and the ship foundered.
1,514 lives were lost. Just let that number sink in for a second. That night didn't just claim families, crewmen, and immigrants hoping for a better life. It completely shattered the 20th century illusion of order, certainty, and our supposed mastery over nature. Before the Titanic, society really felt this quiet confidence. Afterward, it was all tumult and disillusionment.
Section 6, a legacy of safety.
History is rarely shaped by the loudest voices. Sometimes it's profoundly changed by the silence of those we lose. The horrific aftermath of that night permanently changed the way the whole world communicates. Take a look at this brilliantly modified radio room clock. This right here is the visual impact of the tragedy. See those red markings? After the disaster, global regulations mandated 2 3-minute silent periods every single hour. During these red zones, all routine radio traffic globally had to stop. Operators had to just listen. They listened to ensure that no faint distress call, crying out in the dark, would ever be talked over or ignored again.
The sweeping changes were almost immediate. Just weeks later, the International Radiotelegraph Convention met, which led to the U.S. Radio Act of 1912 and the very first Safety of Life at Sea, or SOLAS, convention. They finally brought order to the chaotic airwaves. 24-hour continuous radio watches were made totally mandatory for large ships. The SOS distress signal was standardized globally. Emergency messages were given absolute, unquestioned priority over general correspondence. And independent, backup power supplies were mandated, ensuring a ship would never lose its voice so easily again. The unimaginable tragedy of the Titanic actually became the foundation for modern maritime safety and our global communication standards. The hard lessons they learned from those chaotic, overlapping radio waves of 1912 built the system that still protects seafarers to this very day. Which leaves us with this final thought. The Titanic's crew had the absolute most advanced technology of their time, yet they basically drowned in a sea of noise and misplaced confidence. Today, we're more connected than ever, surrounded by infinite streams of data. But as we navigate our own modern ice fields, are we truly listening? Or are we still ignoring the loudest warnings? Thank you for exploring history with me on this explainer. Never stop asking questions, and I'll see you next time.